Hey everyone, how you doing? Welcome to the channel. I hope you had a good reading month in July. Mine was a little bit up and a little bit down, so let's go and talk about it. So I'm sure most of you know the drill by now, but just in case you don't, the usual rules apply. Stats first, then books, timestamps down below. Away we go. So I read 6 books in July. I had an additional DNF as well. I don't include the DNF in my stats, and I had 2 more SPFBO reads as well. So the stats for my average rating, I have included them in there because I have rated them, but I won't be discussing those ratings in this video. I won't do that until I've read all of the 6 books in my allocation and announced my semi-finalist. So for the 6 books that I completed, I had a total page count in July of 3,132, taking me to a year-to-date total of 22,563 pages. The average page count for July was 522, year-to-date that's now sitting at 533. And the average rating for the 6 books I completed was 3.75, which means my year-to-date total, or my year-to-date average so far, is now at 4.04. For the series stats, I've now started 10 series this year. That's 10 that I intend to continue with. There are 7 that I've decided that I'm not going to continue with after reading book 1. I've finished 3 series now. I'm up to date with 16, so I've now got 34 in total on my ongoing series list. And then the last little stat, as always, is the days since the last 5-star read, which this month is sitting pretty at 3 days. So as usual, talking about the books, I'll go through the DNF first and then the SPFBO reads, and then I'll go through the rest of the books that I completed in chronological order as I read them. For the DNFs, I didn't check before coming to film actually, but I think I'm now on 7 for the year. I think I might literally have DNF'd 1 book every single month. I don't think I've doubled up in any, but I might have done, that's not important. There's no plan, there's no target for DNFs or anything along those lines, except for, you might have seen my recent video on embracing the DNF. I've decided that I'm going to do just that. I'm going to DNF books more often if I'm not enjoying them. So hopefully that number will be very low because I want to enjoy every book that I pick up. Otherwise, why would I be picking it up? Sadly, it does happen sometimes, and sometimes it is actually a very sad day because it's often with a book that I had high hopes for and that I was looking forward to really enjoying. That definitely applies for July's DNF, which was Isla's Reach by Francisca Liliana. So I received this from the author. I was really looking forward to it. I love that cover. It really speaks volumes about what I'm expecting to read in the book itself. But unfortunately, I just couldn't get into it and I DNF'd it at 15%. I did say on a couple of different occasions in my update video that I do on a weekly basis to my patrons that I was giving this one another go because it wasn't really working for me, but I just wanted to give it a little bit more because the last chapter I read, it seemed like it might be turning a page, so to speak, but then the chapter after that was right back to the reasons that I DNF'd it. So first of all, as far as the story goes, obviously I didn't get too far into it. It had some interesting characters and some interesting magic. The world building, although I didn't delve too far into it at 15%, I could see that there was a really nice kind of varied world in here with some really interesting elements. The big dragon that you've got on the cover there was quite interesting because often where you have these kind of Dragon Rider stories, and although I didn't get that far, I assume there's an element of that in here, those stories tend to start with the young character finding the dragon egg, inheriting the dragon egg, being given the dragon egg, whatever it is, they bond with the dragon from birth, and that's different. That's not what happens in here. It's a fully grown adult dragon, and I did like that as a bit of a twist on that normal trope. I thought it was an interesting opening. It kind of put me in mind of The Fall by Ryan Carhill, the novella that starts off the Bound and the Broken series, because that one was set I think it was 400 years before the main events of the book, and you've got this big battle with dragons in the air and all hell being loose down below, and that's kind of what you've got in the prologue here. It's not as far ahead, I think it's 20 or 30 years before the events in the story, but again you've got this big battle and dragons in the air and people who are bonded to those dragons, and it was a very interesting opening for me to be reading. What I didn't like in here, and the thing that really kind of took me out of it and eventually led to me DNFing it, was sadly the technical qualities of the book. There were a lot of sentences that I had to really read a couple of times to try and figure out what they were trying to say. And I kept skipping back to the top of the page to reread whole passages, and there were quite a lot of typos in here as well. So it just felt like it wasn't quite a polished novel, and normally I'll skip past those because I know traditional published, self-published, whichever you're reading, you're going to find mistakes, typos and errors in there, but just the sheer volume of them in here really threw me out of the story too often, and I got to the point where enough was enough and I just couldn't continue because sadly I wasn't able to enjoy the story. Next up, I'm going to talk about the two SPFBO 9 reads that I had. So the first of those was Ask Fees by Rebecca Schmid. For both of these books, I do have dedicated video reviews that I'll link in the cards in the top corner. Go and check those out for my full kind of thoughts on the books, but I'll give a bit of an abbreviated look at them just here. So for Ask Fees, it really wasn't the story that I was expecting from reading the synopsis, and I'm quite pleased with that because I'm quite happy with how it turned out overall. There's a lot of politics in here, there's a lot of kind of subtle world building. It's not necessarily in your face, but there's quite a lot of it on show as you're reading through, so I did like that. There's quite a bit of magic, there's a bit of romance in there as well, so there's a lot there in this book, depending on, of course, what you're looking for in a fantasy. One of the things that I did particularly like about this one is the kind of subterfuge element of it. So you've got this society, essentially this kingdom, that pulls the strings of all the other kingdoms, but they don't know it, as should be the case basically if they're doing a good job of it. They control governments, they control who sits in seats of power, and the story, or the main part of the story that you've got here, is them trying to get rid of a ruler and replace them with their preferred candidate. And their agents, rather than going in and assassinating this leader, they go in there instead and they make friends. They become essentially part of the nobility. They start pulling the strings from kind of close up essentially, and getting them to the point where they can kind of supplant their leader but think it's their own choice, their own reasonings behind it, rather than someone pulling the strings behind their back. I did like that. I thought it was well done. I did mention in my review that normally when you see that kind of thing, I'm used to it being kind of quite quickly done, even if it's the overriding theme of the book. And in here, you could tell it was a long con. They were there for the long haul. It wasn't just a quick in and out. And I really appreciated the time and the effort taken to make that all right, essentially. Overall, it was a very interesting book. It was a bit of a surprise for me because you can't really get too much from the cover. The synopsis does a really good job of hiding a lot of what you'll find in the story. It doesn't really give anything away there either, but I did have a pretty good time with this one overall. The next of my SPFBO books was Unfamiliar Territory by R. Lindsay Carter, and again this one was a little bit different maybe to what I'd been expecting. It's for my normal reading and the books that I normally feature on my channel that you're kind of used to seeing, this one's maybe a bit of an anomaly because it's a bit like an urban fantasy with elements of the paranormal, and it's got a bit of a younger reading age as well, I would say. Again, I did quite enjoy this one, even though it's not necessarily my normal cup of tea. There were some really good elements in it. So we have here a main character who I did joke with a couple of people. The main character is 2.5 years old, but that's because she's a cat. She's got a secret, essentially. She appears normally, to people at least, as a 20-ish, I think 22-year-old young woman who's a bounty hunter, but her natural form is actually a cat. She's descended from a long line of witches, familiars, and that gives us the main almost background element of the story, but certainly the main antagonist of what I suspect will be the series rather than just this one particular book. So I won't go into all of that because of obviously spoiler reasons, but it was an interesting world. You've got all these different creatures. There are links to our world as well. It talks about a portal being opened up at one point from our world to theirs, but it's not really an integral element of the story. Someone did comment on the video when I mentioned that and said that it does play a bigger part in later books in the series. So if this is something you enjoy, you've got that kind of reveal, I guess, to look out for. But I did like the overall concept here where you've got this bounty hunter who essentially can turn into a cat. It's more a cat who can turn into a human, but the way people see it, you've got this bounty hunter who can turn into a cat, and that gives so many benefits to someone doing that job. They can go places unseen, they can get into places that a human wouldn't be able to get into, they can communicate with animals, which helps with tracking down their mark and all things like that. So yeah, it was a very unusual for me read, but quite an interesting one, and one that, despite not being my normal cup of tea, I was still able to enjoy. Okay, so then I'll go on to the other books that I read in the order that I read them for the month. And I started the month with Dead Stars Part 2 by Ben Galley, which was book 4 of 4 in his Emaneska series. That is another series finish for me, my third of the year in the 7th month. So well, I'm starting to get there at least. This one was kind of difficult for me, I suppose. It was definitely better than Dead Stars Part 1, book 3 of the series. But sadly for me, that's not necessarily a ringing endorsement, because I really didn't have a great time with Dead Stars Part 1. And I did say in my Patreon video when I wrapped this one up for my Dragon Lords that I think it was Patrick Ryan said it really well. He finished this book kind of a month before me, and he said that the experience that he had with book 3 really tainted the experience he had with book 4. So book 4 wasn't a great book, but it was more because of book 3 than book 4. So that doesn't really sound right, but I 100% agree with him, because I had such a roller coaster of experience with these books, not a roller coaster of emotions. But literally, my thoughts on book 1 were great, my thoughts on book 2 were possibly even better, book 3 was a real dip, and then book 4 was up again, but I was still feeling that low from book 3, so it really did taint my experience of book 4. We had kind of more of the same from the first two books, so it was back to familiar settings, familiar characters, everything was all back, it's like the gang was all back together. But the damage had been done as far as my enjoyment, and I felt exactly the same as Patrick did, in that I didn't really feel invested in these characters anymore. I didn't really care for them the way that I did in the first two books, and so that really tarnished my overall experience. Rather than just going over and repeating kind of the same thing again, I'll skip straight ahead to the ratings. It was really disappointing, especially to end the series as well. You want to go out of the series on a high, and sadly for me, Emaneska didn't do that with Dead Stars Part 2. I ended up giving this one just 3 stars. Then I read Persepolis Rising, which was book 7 in The Expanse by James S.A. Corey, part of my ongoing buddy read with Nina. We're nearly there, 2 more books to go, and this one was really weird. So I said for book 6 that it felt really like a transition book. It was really wrapping up the arc of the story that we had in the first 5 books and preparing us for the remaining story arc for the last 3 books. That was definitely the case, but really not in a way that I expected. There's a big time jump here. We start the book, I think it was 28 years after the end of book 6. You've got the same characters there. Nothing really seemed to have changed in terms of character dynamics, who's with who, in kind of location, not relationship, so to speak, or close relationships. But in terms of the kind of found family aspect and things like that, everyone was still on the same ship, pretty much. Everyone was kind of in the same position of authority and things like that. It seemed like 28 years had gone by, but nothing had really changed. So it was really strange. And then you've got the characters themselves. So in the original books, in the opening kind of 5-6 books in the series, I don't know if we're given ages for the characters, but using my knowledge of them from the TV show and what I gather from the books, you get the impression that, I don't know, they're all the main core of the characters are probably in their 30s, maybe going into the 40s and so forth. So you're adding 30 years onto that. Suddenly you've got a main cast of characters who are 60, 70, potentially beyond. I did hear someone say that Alex, the pilot of the Rocinante, would be around about 80 by the time we get to these books, these final books in the series. And they're still kind of doing the same thing. So you've got technological advancements with medical and health and things like that, but still you've got these 60, 70, potentially beyond year-old people running around acting the hero out in space just the same as they were 30 years ago. And it was just kind of strange, but also it almost seemed there was no reason for it, because nothing really seemed to change, as I say. So it was kind of very strange, almost a case of, well, why is there such a big time jump when there doesn't need to be? It doesn't mention their age at any point. It doesn't really talk about them much being old. So yeah, it was just very strange. As far as the story itself goes, it was kind of mediocre for me, I would say. Not one of my favourites by any stretch in the series. We have been kind of on a bit of a down. I've only read 2 books since, but since Nemesis Games book 5, that's where the series peaked for me. It's not quite got up towards that level again. So the story was enjoyable, but it's mostly because I'm so kind of at home and comfortable with the setting, the characters and all of that, rather than necessarily the individual merits of this one particular volume. So this one I ended up giving 3.5 stars for, which I think might be my lowest rating for any of the Expanse books so far. Next up, I did a really bad buddy read with my friend Patrick from Patrick Ryan. Check out his channel, I'll have it linked down below. But this one wasn't bad in the way that matters, which is the book itself. So we decided we were going to buddy read Ascendant, book 1 of Songs of Chaos by Michael R. Miller, and this is one that was on my list. It's one of the self-published books that I wanted to read this year for my 2023 reading plans. So I was really happy that we were both going to read it and we could do so together. But things didn't really work out because Patrick started it a day or 2 before I was able to start it, and by the time I got around to picking this one up, he'd already blasted through and finished the entire thing, so never mind. Reading it on my own though, it didn't really matter because I was still enjoying the book, and that's, as I say, the important thing. I was looking at the book itself rather than the buddy read of it. So this one again is slightly different, I suppose, for your typical Dragon Rider story. So I said normally you get the whole young person, the main character, picks up a dragon egg essentially and bonds with the dragon from birth. That's exactly what you get here. But the difference is, and if you don't know it already, you can maybe tell from the cover, this dragon is blind. So normally you've got a process where the matriarch of the dragons kind of inspects the eggs and is able to sniff out, for want of a better term, any weakness basically, and she moves those eggs to the side and they're got rid of because they don't tolerate weakness essentially. So this egg is going to be discarded, destroyed, because she could sense there was something wrong. But our hero can't bring himself to help out in that, and he smuggles the egg out, hatches it, bonds with it, and so forth. And that's where we get our 2 characters gracing this glorious cover. The story itself was quite interesting. I like how you had the 2 bonding essentially over time, from literally a hatchling to a full-grown dragon that you can see on there, although it does seem to grow really, really quickly because we are pretty much here at the end of the book. The character doesn't seem to have grown much, but the dragon, oh yes, he has. You've got various other Dragon Riders in here as well, and I like the dynamic that you have, and especially the way that they look down on Holt as well, our main character, because he's not one of them really, even though he's got a dragon and he's bonded with it just like they have. He's not spoken the oaths, he's not gone through the training, he shouldn't have this dragon. But I like the way that that's all kind of brought into the story, and obviously I'm not going to spoil it, but with things that happen, it does become very important that these guys are there as well. I like the overall element, the intensity that we get through the events that happen early on and how they play out through the course of the book. And overall, I really enjoyed my time with this one. I'm looking forward to the second and the third book as well that I've got on my shelves waiting for me. And I think, is it going to be 4 or 5 books in this series overall? But if I continue like this one, I'm going to have a really good time with it. I ended up giving this one a very good 4 stars. And then the one book that I forgot to mention in my TBR video at the start of July or end of June was my patron pick this month, or for last month. They chose for me Iron Truth by S.A. Folin, book 1 of the Prima Terre. This was a book that won the very first SPSFC competition, the self-published science fiction competition, and I can see why. I really enjoyed it. It was one that was on my list as well, so that's another book that I've crossed off my self-published books that I want to read this year. But more so, I'm pleased because, as I say, I really enjoyed it. I had a good time with it. Again, it's not a book that I was really expecting. So some months ago I read, well, not even all of it, but I read some of the first chapter for one of my first chapter reads videos. I got an idea of where we were, what the story was going to be about from that. Realised when I picked it up and I continued and things started to really change after a couple of chapters, that I hadn't at any point read the synopsis for this one, so I was literally going in blind. It wasn't just a case of I've read the synopsis and then forgotten it by the time I've picked up the book to start reading it. This one was quite dark. There's a lot of talk of demons. There's kind of a gritty universe, and I would almost go so far as to say the kind of grimdark element in certain settings. And the reason that's, I guess, relevant here is because it really put me in mind of Warhammer 40,000. I've not got a lot of experience with that, but some of the characters that you've got in here, big soldiers in power armor, and they've got all of these augments in them to make them bigger, stronger, faster, quicker to heal, all things like that. And yeah, it really put me in mind of Space Marines from Warhammer 40,000. And of course, Warhammer 40,000 is supposed to be the birthplace of the term grimdark. It's set in the grim darkness of the far future, whatever the initial tagline is. And I could really see that coming out in this book. There was some really kind of dark, grim, no hope kind of scenarios or settings in here. There's a lot of intensity that comes out through that as well, because at various points you've got essentially these super soldiers, so you're never quite sure that they're going to have met their match because they seem to be able to get through anything. But at the same time, not all of the characters have these augments and this power armor, and they're not always in the positions to use them anyway. So you've got all of these scenarios where you're thinking there's no hope whatsoever for all characters. They're outnumbered. They're absolutely surrounded. There's no way out for them. What are they going to do? And then you continue to read on and you find out that a certain character survived one of these certain death scenarios, or this is what they did to get out of that one. It was really interesting. It was really high intensity, something that I very much enjoyed. Overall, I thought the book maybe went on a little bit too long. Part of that was my Kindle telling me that I had 17 hours left to go when I was at 80% through it or something like that. It definitely wasn't 17 hours that I had left to go, but never mind. So it did seem at times like it was a bit never ending, had some really long chapters in here, or at least as far as what my Kindle was telling me, but they were enjoyable, they were fast flowing, so that didn't really make much of a difference. It certainly wasn't a negative for me. So yeah, really enjoyed this one. It was probably my favourite book of the month, certainly in terms of the ratings. I gave this one 5 stars, so it does win the day as far as that one goes. I am going to look to read the next book in the series. I don't know when that's going to be. As I said when I finished it, I think I need a bit of a break first. Going straight into book 2 I think might be a bit too much for this one, but yeah, really looking forward to continuing the series. It was a very interesting world, some interesting characters, and I can't wait to see where they go next. So there we are anyway, my thoughts on the 6 books in the 1DNF that I read in July. I hope you had a good reading month as well. Let me know in the comments down below what your favourite book was, or any other recommendations you had from last month's reading. I'll hopefully catch you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.